session. We are on a regular Zoom, which means that both your video and name will be visible during this session. We invite you to change your Zoom name and turn off your video to promote anonymity if needed. In addition, please note that we do not have an ASL interpreter for this session. However, captioning is available via Zoom during the session. And I'd invite you at this time to use the rename function on Zoom to include your pronouns next to your name. In addition, Dana Pratt will be our Zoom moderator. Dana will monitor the chat if you have any questions about technology or how to access the live captioning. Please use the chat and we will do our best to answer your questions. In addition, Dana will help ensure we are all upholding our community agreement, which can be found in our conference support hub. If at any time you are in violation of our community agreement, you may be asked to leave. During our session, we recognize that the topics being presented may contain potentially triggering or activating content for members of our audience and community. We are committed to honoring the journey each individual takes in healing, so we invite you to engage with this content in a way that is safe and true to your healing. We believe that the topic of navigating online dating through the lens of gender and disability is important to our conference. We want to note that this conversation may include discussions of sexual violence, harm, intimate partner, dating, relationships, violence/harm, and gender-based violence/harm, misogyny, ableism, or ableist violence and harm, as well as strong language. We want to create a space where folks can share their stories while doing so in a considerate and sensitive way. Please feel free to take a break, step away, and or turn off your camera at any point in today's presentation, and to take care of yourself during these conversations. Now, I have the great honor of introducing the presenter for today's session. We are joined here today by Chrissy Rockwell. Chrissy Rockwell is a second-year master's in social work student on Westchester's Philadelphia campus. A women's college alum, Chrissy has her bachelor in politics and women's in studies from Marriott College, Tarrytown. Throughout her 15-year career in the nonprofit sector, primarily in fundraising, communications, and government relations, Chrissy has been blessed to help advance the mission of important causes. Several years ago, personal circumstances, she was exposed to social workers and their vital mission. These encounters encouraged her to move to the front lines and pursue social work as a career. Chrissy loves the social work program at the Philly campus and is focused on social justice, a passion of hers, especially when viewed through a Catholic lens. Chrissy identifies as a disabled student, as a woman in recovery. Most importantly, she is owned by a 9-year-old calico cat named Lamb Chop. At this time, I'd like to turn the session over to our presenter. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Let me, if my mouse starts. So I have my own content warnings as well, some strong language. I curse way too much for anybody who's ever considered being a nun. There's some ableist language, ableism, violence and harm, fatphobia, intimate partner, dating language, violence and harm, gender-based violence and harm, misogyny, suicide, self-harm I mentioned. I use identity-based disability language, which is very important to me. I also use some mad pride language, and there's some religious themes. So again, make sure you take care of yourself. Like we discussed, I'm an MSW student on the Philly campus. I'm also a GA at the Success Center on the Philly campus. I came to social work through my work with the Catholic Church via the Aquinas Center and through my own recovery and journey with mental illness and disability. I came through this project through Dismantling Ableism class 582. which is a fantastic class. If you are in the grad social work program, I recommend you take it. It's an async class, which is unfortunate, but it's a great class learning about ableism and disability, and I just love the class. And the final project was a project on how to handle and what to do dismantling ableism. It's taught by Dr. Mia Ocean, and she approached me. I had her in a class before, and she had approached me about writing an article for the journal Disability and Society about my experience as a disabled woman. And after a period, like I had said before, I had discerned religious life and a consecrated life, a religious vocation. And so after a period of celibacy, discerning religious vocation, I decided to dip my toes back into the dating pool again, because really, how can you discern religious life if you don't know what you're missing? So thinking of a topic, dating and dating as an older woman and dating as a disabled woman was front of mind. So that was my topic. And I'm still working on it, actually. And that's part of what I'm bringing to you right now. As I wrote for my reflection on the paper, it's been like pulling teeth. And I attribute that to it being such a raw and personal topic for me. I was really unprepared to write it emotionally. But I'm here today to share where I'm at the process with you all, and talk about some bullshit really that comes up in the dating scene with ableism and misogyny especially, and where all these things might intersect. So like any good procrastinator, I have the introduction to the article, and I'm really happy with the introduction. And I'm going to share that with you now. So I'm going to read from a paper. I apologize. Okay. There are a few things on my OkCupid profile that some would consider third rail issues, but I use them to weed out people I wouldn't be interested in from the jump. First off, I put my actual birth date in, and my real age shows up. Being a woman in your 40s on dating sites decimates the number of matches you have. I mentioned that I don't drink or use drugs. I don't come out and say I'm in recovery, but I do have the Serenity Prayer on my profile for those in the know. I talk about my weird brand of devout leftic Catholicism and my unhealthy obsession with Law and Order SVU. I have attractive pictures of myself on my profile, but it's easy to tell I wear a size 16 rather than a 6. I said I do this to weed people out I wouldn't be interested in, but in truth, I do all these things out of self-protection. Online dating is emotionally draining, no matter how cool and hardened you are. Getting excited about the first date and then getting ghosted stings like hell. However, not getting excited about the first date is giving up before you even start. What fun is dating if you're squashing butterflies so you don't get disappointed by yet another mediocre man? So I try to avoid disappointment by disclosing potential first date bugaboos on my dating profile. If a man still messages me, he's passed the first asshole test. Or should I say, I've passed the test. I'm still scared to disclose my invisible disabilities that invariably come up and can derail a relationship. And I'm not alone. In my research for this article, I've come across countless stories of disabled people, both with visible and invisible disabilities, and the reluctance to share their disabilities on dating profiles. These are just some screenshots of my dating profile, and I'm very, what's the word I'm looking for? I can't figure out the word I'm looking for, but I like to cut myself up so that others won't cut me up first. So, I have that, my weirdest quirk is going to confession and mass. I did put the Serenity Prayer in and some of the things I can never do without. I try to be as honest, have some full figure pictures up there, things like that. But be funny at the same time, like my favorite conspiracy theory, those kinds of things. just trying to like weed out people. Okay, Cupid is a cesspool, okay? Like it is a cesspool. But I don't have the same problems I think that other people have. In that I mentioned religion. I'm fat, which avoids all of the tons of people who are just looking for hookups. And I don't swipe on people with wild age differences. I think that keeps from just getting all of the hookups and which is fine if you're looking for hookups. I'm not looking for hookups. But I think that keeps from the nonsense and the cesspoolness of OkCupid. And I've been able to go on some relatively okay dates. So disclosing disabilities. There's a couple reasons why people don't disclose, and they fall into two categories that I found. The first one I think is easier to understand, and it's stigma. And stigma doesn't come from people's direct experiences. It comes in from what they fill in the blanks with, right? So what it is they might understand or think they understand about disability. And this is both for physical disability and invisible disabilities, or visible disabilities and invisible disabilities, I should say. People are afraid. There's the stigma that disabled people are asexual, which is really just a ridiculous and horrible stereotype and stigma that's out there. There's there's a stigma that you'll have to take care of somebody for the rest of their lives, that they're not going to be able to take care of themselves. There's a lot of those kinds of things, and you want to avoid that. You don't really, I know for me and myself, I want to avoid that. I don't want to put that out there. It's really difficult to put that out there. It's really difficult to navigate that and to want to share that with somebody and have to deal with the assholes who want to react to that. And I think it's also disappointing because when somebody seems like they're a good person and when somebody seems like they're not another mediocre man. And I'm sorry, I'm using that language because I date men, but they seem like they're okay, and then something comes out with like, oh, well, you're on disability because I collect SSDI and I don't want to have to take care of you. That really hurts, and that's a really difficult thing to go through. And it's also untrue because guess who's taking care of me? The government. So, I'm also taking care of myself. I'm in school, so I don't need you to take care of me. The other kind of reason, or the other kind of thing, is the grand narrative, which is kind of like able-bodied people feel like they own disabled people and they're owed their stories. And in the same way that men can feel like they're owed the stories of women and of people of other genders. And I wanted to read another part of my paper for you. Able people feel like they owed disabled people in our stories. They need disabled people to constantly fight their disabilities to feel better about themselves in a temporarily able-bodied state. If we're not trying to overcome our disabilities in an inspirational narrative, it's another thing wrong with us. Our disabilities do not owe the able-bodied a success story. Not everyone is on a journey to recovery, and it is something difficult for the able-bodied to accept. That disabled people can accept their disabilities and thrive without trying to be normal. And all of this, I'm not talking about gender specifically right now, but all of these would not exist if it weren't for the patriarchy setting up that that frame that we're existing in and operating under, that patriarchal frame that's setting up and saying that people can't be disabled and people can't be, you know, disabled people aren't normal. Let's see where else we are here. We're talking about navigating relationships as well. So I was workshopping this article with a colleague who I believe IDs as abled. And I was talking about my feelings of trust and intimacy while starting a new relationship and how to navigate those with online dating in light of my mental illnesses and my disabilities. And the colleague had mentioned that everyone has issues with trust and intimacy, and it's a minefield whether or not we're dealing with a disability. And like, it's true, everybody does have those issues, but I hold that that attitude in and of itself is a bit ableist because it doesn't take into account those with mental illnesses and disabilities. Rejection can be a life and death struggle, right? Like, so one of the hallmarks of borderline personality disorder is an extreme sensitivity to rejection. So for online dating, rejection is huge, right? Like, people swipe on you, they ghost you, they do all kinds of shit. And the stakes are just so much higher. 10% of people diagnosed with borderline personality disorder die by suicide, and 75% of people self-harm. So there's a lot of huge stakes with rejection. There's educating your partners if you get through it. There's somebody on the call right now with whom I had to go through a huge education about my illnesses, that, you know, I wasn't being dramatic. This was how I was acting through my illnesses. This is how I react to rejection. This is how I react to perceived abandonment. And those are really hard struggles to deal with, on top of the fact that dating online is how everybody dates now. Add into it being an older woman, being a fat woman, being a leftist religious person in the world that doesn't accept really either one of those. Like, all of these kinds of things going on. And is it really worth it? You know, is it worth educating? Is it worth, God, I don't even know if it's worth it, man. Like, and I'm sorry for using that gendered language, but I don't know if it's worth it. It really does get so tiring, and it really gets so exhausting to go through all of this again and again and again. So that is where I am on that uplifting note. I wanted to hear you all's experience, if anybody had any experience in any of this, in online dating, if anybody wanted to disclose any disabilities if they wanted to, online dating while disabled, or, you know, just dealing with this minefield of nonsense. And I wanted to thank CWGE and Mia Ocean and Ben Morgan and Eugene Friesen, who are not mediocre men, for helping me out with this presentation and paper. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Chrissy, so much. And if anyone wants to, this definitely is a conversation, I think, too, gave us a lot to think about, especially recently, personally, like challenging what disability is, and what we see it as, because disability fits all different people. It doesn't look like one thing. So I just want to thank you so much for being honest with us and sharing that with us. If anyone has any questions or wants to share, you can put that in the chat, or you can unmute yourself. I have a question.
Oh, go ahead, Taylor. You go first.
Um, I'm wondering if you have any advice, especially for some of the folks in the session, on knowing that like your power in disclosing your own disability, but also what how to navigate that, especially in relationships, more on having that conversation on when you feel is necessary to disclose that on your own time, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And it's so funny. Like right now, I'm in the mood to do it sooner rather than later. Um, Especially like I wouldn't call it a relationship because it was only like a month and a half, but I just got out of a relationship where I um, disclosed early that I was on that I was disabled and on SSDI, and hilariously enough, with another social work student um, who like kind of threw that back in my face, which was unfortunate. But at the same time, it was like, it was good because while it was going on and before he threw that back in my face, I felt like a little more honest. And I felt like, because I hustle, like I go to school and I work part-time and I hustle and I collect SSDI. But like I always overemphasize my hustling, like because I do some freelance work and I do some freelance fundraising and stuff like that. So I always overemphasize the hustle part and like de-emphasize the fact that I collect benefits because like who wants to talk about how much they collect benefits for? So it's like it's a really difficult thing to navigate, especially when I wind up talking with and dating with a lot of people who are educated and work full-time jobs and work educated jobs and like middle class jobs and stuff like that. So I was very comfortable with like, oh wow, I like came out as like disabled really early on. And I'd probably do it again, but I think everybody has their own comfort level. And I think it's, I have a advantage over people with physical and visible disabilities in hiding it as long as I want to, but it's also not an advantage in a way because like the longer I hide it, the more it's, well, what were you hiding? And what weren't you talking about? And what is this manipulation? Because people will see it as manipulation, but you also don't want to spill your guts straight away. So it's a balance.
Thank you so much, Chrissy. I know we do need to be mindful of time for next sessions, but if anyone has any comments or questions quickly for Chrissy, I just want to thank her so much for being on the Zoom with us today and for all of y'all joining us. Um, yes.
Hey, Chrissy, I just wanted to say thank you so much for your presentation. I thought it was really insightful. I had a kind of cool, hopefully quickish question. I'm curious, you'd mentioned you'd shared a little bit about your online dating experience been primarily through OkCupid. Have you found, is it any better on other apps? Personally, I haven't found it's any better on any other websites or apps, but I was curious what your take on that was.
No, I think it's better on OkCupid because I can have a really long profile and put a lot of different stuff on it, where the other ones I'm like very short and it's more hookup-y. Like, so I can have, like I said, like a longer profile and put more about being Catholic and like the kind of relationship that I'm looking for in my OkCupid profile.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Great question. Um, thank you again to all our brilliant presenter for joining us today, and for all of y'all for joining us. I now will pass it over to Dana Pratt, to introduce our next session, which starts shortly.
Hi all.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Before I do that, I just wanted to share this with you guys in case you needed anything for attendance. We would love if you could let us know that you were there, or if you're doing it extra credit for a class, this is the way that you can show that you attended the session. I'm just going to leave that up for a few minutes. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing now so that we can introduce our next speaker. Of you that are joining us, welcome to the Gender Justice Conference. My name is Dana Pratt, and I'm a peer educator at the Center for Women and Gender Equity, and I'll be the facilitator for this session today. Today, we joined the conference with the intent to explore knowledge, skills, and attitudes necessary to engage social change work with a special focus on disrupting gender oppression. We are currently in a session, Gender Justice Power Brunch, the history and weaponization of Black women's sexuality. Just a note, we will be recording this session. We are in a regular Zoom, which means that both your video and name will be visible during this session. We invite you to change your name and turn off video to promote anonymity if needed. In addition, please note that we do not have an ASL interpreter for this session. However, captioning is available via Zoom during this session. I'd invite you at this time to use the rename function on Zoom to include your pronouns next to your name. In addition, Lauren Zahor will be our Zoom moderator. Lauren will monitor the chat, so if you have any questions about technology or how to access the live captioning, please use the chat and we'll do our best to answer your questions. Lauren will help ensure that we are all upholding the community agreement, which can be found in our conference support hub. If at any time you are in violation of our community agreement, you may be asked to leave. During our session, we recognize that the topics being presented may be potentially triggering or activating content for members of our audience and community. We are committed in honoring this journey each individual takes in healing, so we invite you to engage with this content in a way that is safe and true to your healing. We believe that the topic is important to our conference. We want to create a space where folks can share their stories, while doing so in a considerate and sensitive way. In today's presentation, the conversation may include sexual violence, harm, intimate partner dating relationship violence and harm, gender-based violence, harm, misogyny, racism, racist violence and harm, examples of white supremacist violence. Please feel free to take a break, step away, and/or turn off your camera at any point in today's presentation and take care of yourself during these conversations. Now I have the honor of introducing our presenters for today's session. We are joined by Tasia Norman and Leilani Adens. And at this time, I would like to turn our session over to the presenters. And Tasia and Leilani, if you want to tell us a little bit about yourself, you're free to do so at this time.
Okay, hi everybody. My name is Tasia. I am in my last semester here at Westchester. I am a peer educator for Swede, so you might have seen me in some other facilitations before. I'm also, I said criminal justice on me already, but I'm also a resident assistant for Res Life. I'm looking to hopefully in the future go into forensic medicine, crime scene investigation, but I'm also I've also loved taking an interest in the history of Black women, and this topic really interested me. So I just want to give a disclaimer that it's so broad, but it's like such a spectrum and a deep dive of different things that I think that it would be great if you all did like some research on your own time and just got into it.
Hi, I'm Leilani. I'm a junior here at Westchester. I'm a media and culture major, and in the future, I am looking to become a creative director for photo shoots and video shoots. All right, Tasia.
So, in discussing sexuality, or at least the weaponization of it, we have to first discuss what exactly is sexuality. So, sexuality can be described as an expression of sexual receptivity, or an interest, especially when excessive. Sexuality is a word we use to describe how we understand our bodies, how we understand our relationship. This includes basically all aspects of who we are: our values, our beliefs, our desires, these relationships that we might have, our gender, our thoughts and feelings about all of these combined. Because our sexuality is made up of so many different components, our understanding of our own sexuality is always ever changing and unique to each individual person.
All right, so let's get into the Jezebel trope, which is a very, very important part of how Black women's sexuality is seen. So if you're familiar with the typical tropes of a Black woman, you have Jezebel, Sapphire, and Mammy. Mammy is the complete opposite of Jezebel. She is asexual, completely dedicated to the care of white children, and basically she's there to work. Jezebel, on the other hand, she is seen as seductive, sexual, a worldly bad girl, and she's most categorized by her insatiable sexual appetite. So Kay Sue Jewell conceptualized Jezebel, kind of gave her a face. She saw her as a mulatto with light skin, straight hair, thin lips, and slender nose. So basically a mixed woman who adhered more to European beauty standards. But that is a very narrow idea of Jezebel, because most Black women have been forced into this trope, regardless of skin color or how their features relate to European beauty standards. Right. But so Jewel's concept was based on the fact that during slavery, many prostitutes were mulatto, and many of the freeborn light-skinned women had arrangements. They were the willing concubines of rich white men in order to take care of their families. Okay, so depictions of Jezebel pre-60s. So most of the time, you did not see Jezebel in mass media before the 60s. At that time, it was mostly seen in American material culture. So you could find depictions of half or fully naked Black women, on drinking glasses, ashtrays, postcards, sheet music, basically anywhere. And this just further pushed the narrative that our bodies are objects to be used. Within the Jezebel category, within Jezebel, you have two categories. You have the pathetic other and the exotic other. So the pathetic other, she is depicted as unintelligent, unattractive, and uncivilized, and having no good feminine traits. So basically it was seen as she's overly sexual, but it's kind of a joke because no white man would ever want her. It's just over and over again being pushed that these women are sexual, but they're not desirable. This was also seen in the way that they portrayed children. As you can see from our slides, you have a young girl being portrayed as a Jezebel. She has a young face, but she's posed sexually and her body is exposed.
So looking back into the history of the Jezebel, we have to see where it all actually came from, and especially that pertaining to Black women's differences in slavery. So the differences between Black men and Black women was significant in the fact that Black women's sexuality was exclusively exploited, and it was one of the main factors that differentiated the two. The Black bodies as a whole were seen as objects, these objects to be owned or utilized. The term medical superbodies was coined by Kara Mankey. This basically kind of referred mostly to Black women in the sense that they were seen as the universal norm of healing. These two Black bodies were not held in the sense of gender as much. They were equal in the sense that not gender was superior to the other. Black women were not seen as the weaker sex, just like Black men were not seen as the head of the household. Slavery was a condition. This condition passed from mother to child through birth. Black people as a whole were seen as sexually lewd and lascivious beings. This idea predates American slavery. If we go back into the way Europeans, the way that they perceived African culture, they definitely viewed them as very sexually lewdous in the way that they dressed, how they danced, the way that they walked around naked. They used the lusty Moor as a stereotype to justify slavery, and especially in pertaining to Black women. Black women were especially prone to forms of sexual violence. This is one of those significant factors that differentiate the experiences. The Jezebel stereotype was basically used to say that Black women cannot be raped because they always want to have sex, which we know, of course, is not true. From the end of the Civil War era to the mid-1960s, no Southern white man had been convicted of raping a Black woman. Both free and enslaved Black women in the South and so on, they were excluded from rape laws. Many Black women, abolitionists and women's rights activists demanded justice, but in demanding justice for their body autonomy, they did bring forth a question that many at this time frame were not willing to hear. And this question definitely being, what would it mean to acknowledge Black women as full citizens with legal capacity and political consent? So in the sense of sexuality as a whole during slavery, sexuality was briefly mentioned in casual conversation, or not briefly, but constant. Black women were often seen as the object of white men's lust and abhorrence. Young slaves were often encouraged to have sex to prepare to become what they phrase them as breeders. If the child would get pregnant, the owners would use that to further the Jezebel stereotype that was mentioned above for these young girls. Black women were not given special treatment, especially Black pregnant women. They were merely seen as cattle to a livestock, you could say. They were being given as much leniency as a cow giving birth to a calf. They'd often receive floggings as well. These women worked in the fields and they had their child on their back, maybe not even 1 or 2 days after giving childbirth. If they had their children, if they couldn't be on their back, they would also be on the ground of the fields nearby while they worked. If they could not be in the fields due to some other reasons, they were being taken care of by the older slaves or the children that were working who could not work yet because they were so young, who probably didn't even know how to take care of kids. So in mentioning the role of the Black woman as breeder, we have to go into kind of like the reproductive roles in society. Definitely this one quote definitely sums up everything, because rape was an uncamouflaged expression of the slave owner's economic mastery and the overseer's control over Black women as workers. So, as I said, reproductive roles and rights. Breeders, Black women, when we refer to them as breeders, this is basically saying that this dehumanizes them in a sense that it's saying that they're vulnerable to all forms of sexual coercion. They were essentially the backbone of slavery. They depended on these insatiable desires of their appetite to produce more slaves. With this, we see how eugenics was born, and eugenics actually means to be well born. And when we move into eugenics, this quote definitely sums it up. If you're sterilizing someone, you are saying, not, if not directly, your possible progeny are inassimilable, and we choose not to deal with that. That came from William Deverell. So basically, eugenics was the practice or advocacy of controlled selective breeding of human populations, as by sterilization, as we all know, to improve the population's genetic composition. This was especially prevalent in the South. It was based off of these people trying to improve society by the insurance of birthing out these desirable traits. And these desirable traits focus solely on race a lot of the times, which is why it affected people of color more predominantly. The North Carolina Eugenics Board was founded in the 1930s, and at this time, the rate of sterilization or sterilized Black women was at 23%. Along this time, there also was the fear that white people would die out and Black people would make welfare more accessible to themselves. And this kind of is later proven or assessed by a document called the Moynihan Report in 1965. So with this scariness of Black people to be on welfare, we have, in the Moynihan Report, they also coined that phrase, welfare queen, also saying that they were taking over this public assistance. So this caused a rise in sterilization of Black people. The board's idea of desirable traits largely relied on race. In 1964, it had risen from 23% to 64% of Black women that were sterilized, and by 1968, it had, even though the border was disassembled around that time, it had risen from 64% to 68% just in that small time frame, with the primary target of these sterilizations being Black women on public assistance who were given no choice or forced into it, an unknown.
All right, so Jezebel in the media. So the first real depiction of Jezebel, of the stereotype of Jezebel in the media, took place in 1915 on a film called The Birth of a Nation. The character who played our Jezebel was called Lydia Brown. This was one of the first depictions of Jezebel in the media. So before this time, and until about the 70s, we really didn't see very many, it was mostly mammy characters and not very many Jezebels. So basically Lydia's character, she was a mistress to Senator Stoneman, and she was savage, corrupt, and promiscuous, and she was overly sexual, and she used that to trap a good white man. Following that, the biggest boom in the Jezebel stereotype as far as media goes is blaxploitation films. And this is where they handed off they changed from the mammies, the toms, pickaninnies, and tragic mulattoes to the brutes, the bucks, and the Jezebels. So the very first blaxploitation film was called Sweet Sweetback's Badass Song. That was written, directed, produced, and starred in by Melvin Van Peebles, a Black man. And basically this movie kind of set the scene for the basis of blaxploitation films and the formula that it followed. So it was an angry Black man who killed 2 white cops, and from then on, for the rest of the movie, he was on the run. And this presented white audiences with a realistic view of Black life at the time. Like I said, the films followed a basic formula of an angry Black man looking for revenge against the white authority. These films not only perpetuated the sexualization of Black women, but also Black men. So in these films, most of the time, the Black woman's role was the prostitute or the whore or the girlfriend of the gangster, and most of the time they were seen as half naked. Many of these films were X-rated. And it basically just continues to push the narrative, even in movies like Foxy Brown, where the Black woman was the lead, that Black women are sexually aggressive. And even in those moments where they would give Black women just some type of power, it was always, but you're still a whore. Yeah. So then following blaxploitation films, we have the rise of video vixens. So that was the first time that Black women really had any type of say, even though it really wasn't much, in the way that their sex appeal was sold. Most of the time, these video vixens, they were lighter skinned or racially ambiguous. They included women like Corinne Stevens, Tawny Hall, April Clark, who all took the platform of being a video vixen and turned it into different opportunities by being able to model for different clothing brands or get smaller roles in movies. In the video vixen, it does still perpetuate the Jezebel trope, but it does it in a way that, first of all, is very important to Black culture, and second of all, it gives Black women just a little bit of room to be like, okay, I'm allowed to be sexy not without being seen as a Jezebel, but in my own way, in my own right, kind of taking some more ownership of it. So video vixens kind of began in the 80s. At that point, women were seen mostly for their bodies. Their faces weren't really included in it all too much. Around the 90s, it started to shift to where women got most of the camera time and their faces were more included. And you could see more of them, basically. Video vixens were looked down on by most people of other races, and it was said that it influenced the way that young Black girls see themselves and how they would act. There are pros and cons to it, but ultimately, I believe that video vixens, it kind of, there are definitely pros and cons to it. So on one hand, yeah, it feeds into a stereotype, but on the other hand, it does give Black women some type of ability to own their sexual nature in a healthier way.
So I want to take it back and look at everything and how that script got flipped and how society viewed it in a historical sense and not how people of color have viewed it. So if we go back to women during slavery, the femininity that we know today, as talked by Angela Davis, is that it's a byproduct of the Industrial Revolution, as a white women's roles were disseminated into the role of the housewife, and they read romantic novels, they stayed home. Black women were autonomous in ways that white women were not. They were out in the fields. These were seen as taboo in ways, but also this also caused resentment. There was a sort of eroticism to these slave auctions where they were stripped naked, they were covered in oil, and they were poked and prodded. And yes, these were ways to see scars and the determination of the health of the slave, but it had a sexual connotation to it. And we can also have a stark contrast in this area where the nakedness in the 18th and 19th centuries was seen as a lack of civility and sexual restraint. White women, in contrast, were fully clothed and therefore deemed to be civil and sexually pure. This contributed to a lot of the seeds of oppression and that differences between these different types of women. So moving into women's rights movement, white women have historically taken language issues and strategies from Black women to create their own tasks and their own agendas. They've often taken the fight and the struggles of Black women, have incorporated them into their fight to utilize their strategies while also having them in the background as holding hands, but also not helping them in their own struggles. In the 1800s, white women symbolically equated themselves with the slave in order to be taken seriously, as seen by this quote. This kind of like goes with it along with that time, like not that time frame, but further along, they kind of started to do that later on. In the 1920s, white women began to view the world as what benefited them first, and then society second. Society second being that of how they deemed Black women. Women's suffrage movement took inspiration from the Harlem Renaissance. And if you read this quote right here from the 70s, we all know what the 70s time period is taken in. And as mentioned before around this movement, the move for sterilization, the fight for sterilization and for body autonomy from Black women was covered up by the fight for abortion rights by white women around that time too. They were all happening at the same time frame. But what do we hear about more?
Okay, cultural appropriation. So going back to a little bit earlier when I started talking about video vixens, those videos showed a representation of Black femininity in sexuality and style. So our hair, our nails, our jewelry, they were all on display for the world to see. And at the time, most people who were not a part of the community ridiculed the way that Black women dressed, moved, danced, the things that they wore, where we did our hair, because it was seen as ghetto or trashy. But later on, many times white women have taken on our styles and our trends and the things that we've come up with and kind of turned it into their own thing as a way of rebelling against their norm. Most of the time when I see examples of cultural appropriation, it's almost like an escape for a lot of the people that I see doing it. It's an escape and a rebellion against what they are told to do, how they're supposed to act in their white world. And we're used as like the, fun little stop on their way to, getting professional and having to do life. And one of the most defining factors in that is the fact that it was done without recognition.
So bringing this to a close, I thank you all for coming especially, but I just want to leave you all with some things to take away and think about before I start a discourse and the questions if anybody needs to. The overall central theme of what was presented today was the commodification and the dehumanization of Black women as a whole. The strengths learned through adversity that they used to fight for themselves were taken over time and time again for others' agendas, while flushing out the original fighters. The cultures learned and displayed by Black women have been criticized and ridiculed, pushing them to assimilate in other ways, but only for this culture to later be adapted by white women who in these roles make it more accepted for society to digest. While on a contrary note, this can be seen as empowering from a Black woman's perspective, them taking back their sexuality by consensually involving themselves in their own sexualization. This kind of sparked up another fear in society. Like, still, this fear that we're saying is the fact that Black women's bodies being their own and to do with as they please and do with as they want. This adds to the humanity of the objectification of the body and culture stolen and not deemed our own. However, with this expression, we are simply denigrating the roles put upon us from long ago. And are we simply making our bodies for profit and to be capitalized off of? And thank you. I would love to hear if anybody's thoughts on the presentation and any discourse, any questions that you might have. Thank you.
A couple people making some really positive comments in the chat. If anyone likes to check them out, I'm also happy to read them. Or if anyone wants to say what they're saying out loud, that's great too.
I can read this from Amy Hannox. I have a current pop culture reference for thought. In the newly rebooted TV show Fresh Prince, the character Hillary is a social media influencer for her Black culture-themed food cooking. Another character hacked her account to post an overtly sexualized video that she recorded but decided not to post. She was first outraged because it furthered the over-sexualization of Black women, but then she started to receive praise from other Black women for her unapologetic celebration of her body and sexuality. This TV storyline brings up the issue many, I'm assuming most Black women face at some point in their time, hide and avoid their body or physical beauty or celebrate it. I'm curious what thoughts or suggestions you have for any cis or trans women who struggle with what their personal comfort letter is compared to societal stereotypes. That's a good one for you, Leilani.
So personally, when I think about embracing my own sexuality and being okay with being a Black woman and the possibility of being forced into the Jezebel stereotype if I do decide to become a more openly sexual person, it's hard. It definitely is. And I honestly, I can't give you a straight answer for myself because I'm still trying to navigate that and figure that out as a 20-something-year-old, you know? Because on one hand, I have it, elders, people in my family, and the world at large who will tell me, no, you're feeding into the stereotype. You're not supposed to do this. You're not supposed to act like this. You're not supposed to dress like this. But then I have people on the other side who are like, no, it's cool. Like, if you want to be sexual, be sexual. If you want to do you, do you. And I'm trying to kind of find a middle ground because it's, at the end of the day, it should be about the way that I want to be seen, not the way that the world at large is going to view me. But then again, you can't take away the way the world at large sees you, because if you're going to be in professional settings, if you want to be considered certain ways for even future partners, those things matter. So honestly, I can't give you any good advice. It just is a struggle, and it's something that you have to kind of figure out on your own where you want to stand.
It's definitely a spectrum. Dissecting the idea of Black women while boosting those, I'm trying to be mindful of time, sorry y'all. Such as Kim K, who profit off the Black women's bodies. A lot of times we see like the Kardashians, when they get into these situations of cultural appropriation, they tend to stay quiet and do what they do. They stay quiet and profit off of these images, and then they stay quiet while others tend to copy them, and they start the pop culture of this. So to see, it's so interesting to see Kim Kardashian start to delve into that trope of protecting Black women while participating in the objectification of them and seeing them as objects to copy off of and commodify off of to frame our bodies around. And I think that would be an even better discussion to talk about. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, guys.
I just want to quickly thank everyone and our presenters today, and to everyone who participated and for your commitment to the Gender Justice Conference. Now on the screen, there's a QR code in case you need to record your attendance at this session. And we hope you are able to join us for our following session, which is what does eco-gender gap mean for Westchester and for the world? So to learn about these sessions, you can visit the Conference Support Hub, which is in the link below.